The night the ravens would not roost, Winterfell's godswood breathed smoke. It rose in slow threads from the black pool, where the heart tree's roots descended, as if something below had kindled a cold fire that made no heat. Only a pall of breath that smelled of iron and rain. The red leaves didn't stir. The air itself seemed to set like a glaze over bark and water, and the smooth, wet stones that ringed the pool. Snow found the stillness and paused there, landing without sound. A beekeeper's veil of frost had drawn across every twig and nail, across the ribs of the ancient walls, across the bronze bells of the sepulchre door that no one rang. It was the sort of cold that made noise into glass. Even the hammering from the forges came crystal bright and brittle, as if the din might shatter and cascade down into the empty courtyard. Bran sat in the woven chair that Maester Wolkan had padded with folded pelts, and the pelts gathered snow. His legs did not feel the cold through fur and wool. His hands did, though, a prickling along the knuckles and nails that made him think of nettles dipped in river water. He rested his fingertips on the worn wood of the chair's arms and listened to the silence talking to itself. That was how it always began, before the sight. The world folded in like cloth, and shapes pressed through from the other side. Ravens were coming and going in erratic bursts. He felt them as crisp black thoughts in the upper air. He could have slipped into them like a river into riverbanks. It pleased them to circle the heart tree, as if something about the white bark and the bloody leaves was a fire to their feathered minds, a hearth of meaning. Bran let their hunger brush across him. The delicious, simple thrum of it, the way a raven's wanting is a compass you can navigate by. And then the ravens slanted away from him and became their own desires again. "You are in a house of doors," the leaves said. The sound was a wind that wasn't there. "You have opened one. Another waits." He had learned that the voice out of the heart tree was not one voice but many, and some were only echoes of his own, and some were names too old to keep their faces, only the taste of their meaning. He could tell none of that to Sansa, or Arya, or Jon, or the others. He had tried once, and Sansa had put her cool, careful hand on his, and her eyes had been full of kindness and of the ledgers she balanced, the lists of grain, the names of hill clans, the needs of children who had come to Winterfell with no shoes. The talk of doors made her think of hinges and locks, of how the great hall's north gate had swollen in the wet and stuck, and how she had ordered the carpenters to shave it down and set new pins. Bran loved Sansa for that. He loved how she had trained the living world to answer in useful ways. He also loved the unuseful, the doors that opened into memory like a knife sliding into fruit, and he followed those doors even when they crowded him, and left him standing in the long gallery of time, where every step changed the dust. A soft scuff of boot on frozen leaves. Theon Greyjoy stood beyond the low ring of stones, a shadow with a quiver against his back, and a bow unstrung in his hand. He stood as if each bone had chosen to be there. Bran raised his head to look at him. Theon always had a look in the godswood of waiting to be forgiven by something that couldn't forgive. His beard had gone winter pale, iron filings of frost clinging to the black stubble. The Ironborn was wrapped in a dark cloak lined with shearling, and underneath the cloak was a man who had been broken and then reassembled with wire and apology. Bran did not need the sight to know that Theon's apology had no home except his own heart. "They've doubled the watches," Theon said. "Your sister." It was still hard for him to name Sansa as sister, not because she wasn't, but because the word belonged to a vanished, simpler grammar. "The Lady of Winterfell says the outer fires go low after the second bell, and the oil is rationed. We've tarred the siege ladders the wildlings brought and stacked them along the inner yard. She would like you to keep inside tonight." "I am inside," Bran said. He meant the god's head and the blood in its wood, and the endless cool corridors in the ring of roots. He meant the storerooms of time where he was learning the shapes of dust motes by their shadows. He meant the heart tree itself, whose face had watched every winter fail to last, every summer fail to stay. But Theon nodded, as if he meant the keep and the stone and the warmth of a brazier. And Bran let it be so. "Samwell Tarly thinks he found something," Theon went on, and his voice was careful around the name. Respectful, as Ironborn learned to be respectful of men who knew how to milk meaning out of parchment. "He sent for Jon. Jon will come before midnight. The snows ease along the King's Road, he says." Bran gazed at the pool. The faint smoke on it unraveled to nothing. Sam thinks and then believes. It is a good way to save the world. Theon's laugh was only a breath. The world, he said, is not in a saving mood. But we do what we can. You will stay here? Bran said. I will, Theon answered. With my men. He swallowed. With me. He did not speak about the night beyond the trees. How the ice seemed alive enough to carry footfalls. How the sky wore a bruise where the moon should be. He did not say what all men in the north had learned to say only to themselves. That the dead were moving like a disciplined army and like a storm, inexorable in both ways. He did not say how, on the last scout, one of his archers had put an arrow in a pale boy, and the boy had not bled, had not fallen, had kept coming without hurry, as if the rope that pulled him did not care to jerk. The boy had been 6 when he died, or 5 or 7, and his hair had frozen to his skull, and he had one mitten still buttoned to his coat. The archer had not unstrung his bow since that sight. The weirwood leaves were the color of old wounds. Bran closed his eyes. He understood the shape of the coming as a shape inside himself. He understood it as the hand that had pressed a mark into him and left frost beneath his skin that even fire could not burn away. He understood it as an answer to a question he could not remember asking. And he understood it as a face. He had seen that face in dreams that were not dreams, visions that were not only his. A long face with high cheekbones and a mouth that rarely moved to speak, and eyes that burned without heat in a way a child might think was blue, but was not any color at all, only an instruction that the world obey. He had seen that face in the reflection of the black pool, and the water had gone dull as hammered iron when the face looked back. He had seen it peering through snow as if snow were glass. It was not monster to itself. It was a man looking out of a story someone else had decided to tell. Bran let the cold take his fingers to the last joint, and then stepped through the door of himself. The godswood blurred and breathed. The smoke on the water lifted and became a road laid flat across the air. The scuff of Theon's boot receded. The hammering of forges became a heartbeat he didn't need. The red leaves closed without closing, like a mouth muttering a spell, and Bran drifted forward with his palms open. He saw a tower first, not Winterfell's, but one built like a spear of ice, every course of it glistening, the surface crazed with fine fractures that held the reflection of a pale sky. He saw a man bound to a heart tree without leaves, his back scored by the imprint of the bark, and his chest bare. The man breathed like a stag in the last run. He had eyes the gray of storm water over stone. His beard was short and even, like a soldier's compromise with winter. His arms were roped with scars, and one of those scars had the clean look of a blade lifted away from a whetstone. Children surrounded him. Not children of men. Bran knew the difference. These were small as children and old as riverbeds, their hands slim and clever, their hair like woven moss. Before them stood a woman of men, cloaked in dull, tattered furs that had seen smoke and salt, her hair plaited back. She watched the bound man with a grief that had the edge of pride. Bran knew a queen when he saw one, even if the crown was only in how she stood in her bones. One of the children held a shard. Obsidian. Slick as wet ink, cut clean as an icicle, and blacker than a moonless pool. The child's eyes were as green as night where the river runs under trees. She did not look sorry. None of them did. It was not cruelty. It was a ritual with the damp smell of roots and the sweet rot of leaves in spring. They were making a tool in the way you make a pit or a wheel. The bound man did not speak. He tried once, a word that might have been a name, and the sound caught and bent. His mouth closed. He closed his eyes. He kept his spine straight against the tree. The queen looked away, and her breath ended in a small dark laugh that was not unkind. A second man stood apart in the snow. He wore a cloak of white wolf pelts and a ring on his hand shaped like an antler. He had the stark look, the long plains, the eyes that are management of weather. His mouth was grim. He held a sword point down in the snow. The blade was not Valyrian, not dark enough, not rippled, but it was good northern steel, the sort of blade you handed to a son with your own hands. He watched the children. He watched the queen. He watched the bound man with a mortal's hatred of inevitability. He said nothing to stop it. There were other inevitabilities at his back. Bran understood that these three had names with the weight of winter, and that the name of the bound man was also his. The name was Brandon. There had been hundreds of Brandons. This one would be called no epithet that a living tongue would keep. He would receive many from frightened men with wine and fires to warm their throats. He would be something else's artifact. He would be a window for Cole to look through and give orders. Was he your brother? Bran asked aloud to no one. The godswood at Winterfell flickered behind his eyes like a candle behind oiled parchment. He felt the answer come like the pressure of snow sliding off a bough. The name of brother changes with the century. He is yours in all the ways that matter. The child with the shard pressed the obsidian into the man's chest. Not with violence. With a slow, exacting, ceremonial care, as if she were returning a missing piece to a broken thing. When the point found the heart, ice sang. The bound man's back arched. His mouth opened and brought forth a sound Bran had heard only once before in this precise shape. The cry a wet newborn makes when his lungs discover their duty. The shard slid home, and for a heartbeat there was blood. It froze before it had a chance to drop, red threads caught in the low sun. And then a gasp went through the earth. Eyes open-eyed. Not blue, but absolute. The pupil went away. The man drew in him the air without using his lungs. He saw everything too clearly. His hands closed and opened. On the second opening of his right hand, the skin took on a glassy hardness. It crept. Fingers changed to knuckles of polished ice. His mouth made a quiet sound like a blade leaving a sheath. He looked at the queen. She looked back, as at a son on his way to a hard apprenticeship. "You asked us," one of the children said. The voice carried none of the cold. It was the sound of a brook. "You asked us to build this so that the thing under the ice will sleep. We could refuse, but we will not. The woods are our home. We will keep the roof on the world." The man with the wolf cloak bent his head as if in prayer. The sword in the snow trembled. His ringed hand tightened. He might have been whispering a word, perhaps father, perhaps forgive, something of the ordinary language of grief that no magic hears. Bran saw the face again as he had seen it in the pool, but now he knew the bones that structured it, the blood that had once warmed it. He understood that the man inside the ice was a Stark in the way you recognize yourself in a stranger's habit when you put it on and it fits. He understood that this was not a monster's beginning. It was a bargain. He fell backward through time and bark. The godswood took him home. Theon had not moved. His breath made small ghosts at his lips. Above, the ravens had settled, and their eyes were the only sparks in the branches. "My lord," Theon said, quietly, because he had learned that you spoke to Bran in low voices, the way you spoke to wolves, or to mares with colts in their bellies. "He's one of us," Bran said. He felt the cold under his skin clarifying into lines like a map. "And he is coming to ask for the end of it." Theon's hand flexed on the bow. The kind of man he had been would have made a jest and nailed it to this silence. He had no jests left in him. "He asks," Theon said, as if tasting the word to see how it would sit on his tongue. That would be something. They left the godswood by the southern path. Bran's chair slid along the packed snow where men had walked hauling timbers and sacks. The tracks were as neat as writing. The leaves above them held frost like powdered bone in their veins. Sansa met them at the little gate, and her hood was up, and the snow caught in the fur border as if it had been embroidered there with white silk. She had a ledger under her arm even now. It comforted her to keep numbers close. When she saw Bran's face, she passed the ledger to Podrick, who had grown broader across shoulder and chest than the boy he had been. He took it as if it were a newborn, and bowed and kept it dry. "Samwell sent for you." Sansa said to Theon, and then to Bran, "And for Jon, and for me, and for anyone who can read his hand, which is no one but him. He has more scraps than sense, but the scraps make a shape now," he says. "Bah." "They do," Bran said. He didn't smile with his mouth. His eyes had grown to prefer the solemnity that the weirwood taught them. They crossed the yard, their breaths puffing steady. Men and women and children passing them with respect, and the busy silence of near battle. Somewhere to their left, Arya was striping straw soldiers with a little knife and laughing without noise. He felt her as the press of a blade against his wrist might feel if he trusted it completely. Somewhere beyond the kitchens, Ghost lay with his head on his paws and his red eyes tracking the keenness of the wind. Hounds yawned in a line like old men. Davos Seaworth stood speaking with a woman from the Barrowlands who had come with a wagon of barley all the way through the snows. He gave her the kind of listening a man gives when he knows his listening will be carried as a tale back to a village, and the tale will keep someone alive. The long table had been cleared and pushed against the wall. Samuel had made a C out of parchment. It lay in charts, skins, slivers torn from margins, bindings cut, wax seals broken carefully and set aside like coins. There was a crude rubbing in charcoal of an old carving, a map of the land before the wall chewed a straight line into the top of it. There were drawings of trees and of men bound to trees, some with cords, some with ivy, or with something that might be the living skein of roots. Sam's spectacles pinched the bridge of his nose and slid as if trying to escape their duty. He kept shoving them back up with an ink-stained finger. Gilly sat near the hearth with little Sam sleeping in the crook of her elbow. Her eyes were on Sam's hands. She watched her lover like she was watching a fire that might harm or help. And she would do the right thing either way. John stood at the far end by the window that looked down over the inner yard. He had not taken off his heavy cloak. He wore the look he had learned in the South. It was a look that promised he would not let himself be warmed too much by any room he was in. He had hugged Sansa when he came in. Bran had felt the brief, awkward crush of his ribs, and he had kissed Bran's hair and muttered a word that had meant more than it sounded. Now he stood at the window and counted the snowflakes one by one, and made a tally in his head that looked like something else entirely. Sam saw them and broke into a smile that made him a boy again. "You're here," he said. "I know. I sent for you. Still, you're here." He gestured helplessly at the rash of papers. "I don't think there's a nice way to say what these say. At least, not nice in a way that is kind. But maybe, perhaps it is kind to be exact." "Nanny, you read it to us exact," Davos said, stepping in late, shaking the snow off his shoulders and making a face at the warmth. "Gods know we've been lied to enough, and lied on top of that." Sam swallowed. His mouth made small movements, summoning words, sorting them by weight. "There are two old stories that are really one story. Told two ways," he began. "You know them. The Night's King, the 13th Lord Commander who fell in love, or fell under a spell, and ruled cruelly and was cast down by Bran the Breaker and Jorah Mon. And the first of the others, made by the children when men came and cut their trees, forged with dragon glass into the breast of a man tied to a weirwood. Some say they've nothing to do with each other, but this scrap says," he tapped the rubbing as gently as if it had nerves, "that the 13th was of the line of Winterfell, of the blood that held these halls. It says his true name was taken from him. It says he did not wish to rule death. It says he was bound for a purpose that was not what purpose became. And it says that purpose can be unbound." Meh. He looked at Bran then, and found him already looking back. In Sam's mind was a question so clear it may as well have been spoken aloud. "Can you?" And in Bran's mind was the answer made of many voices that were also only his. "Yes, if he wishes, if the wood agrees, if the world makes a seam." Sansa's hand had found the table. She stood lightly, as if not to bruise the wood. "If he is of our blood," she said, "it changes nothing we know we must do. He brings death. He brings winter that devours children and sheep the same. He must be stopped. But if he can be unbound, if the man can be brought forth," she faltered and gathered herself. "Tell us what you think is possible, plainly, now." Sam fumbled for a parchment he had weighted with a pewter cup. He lifted the cup, and water had condensed around its lip. The ring it left on the parchment swelled and then froze. A delicate rhymed coin. "Bran has the truth," Sam said. "I have only the steps that others stepped long ago. There are mentions Snatches. Riddles. That speak of undoing. Not an easy undoing. The shard must be softened or coaxed from the heart without shattering it. Heat alone is not enough. It is a different sort of ice. Fire that is only fire would turn it hard against you. But fire that is tied to the trees. He looked helplessly at Bran again. I know how that sounds. I mean, the children's fires. The fire of long summers, of blood that has been winters and summers both. A fire that remembers. There is a song that is not in any human mouth now. It was made when the first spears were only sticks, and the first domesticated fire was only a stolen lightning. The words here make no. They do not fit in our mouths, but the shapes. If someone could carry that song in him, and place his hand on the heart, and the tree would lend its sap, and the dragon would lend a breath. A dragon, Jon said very softly, and his eyes cut sideways, remembering all the ways dragon meant mother and lover and kingdom and burned flesh. There is less dragon to be had than there was. But there is some. Benderwini. Sansa glanced at him. The glance had in it 1,000 calculations that ended with the same sum. Daenerys was far or near, and trouble, and help, and everything wore a price. Sansa could do 6 kinds of math at once now. She did not let those numbers show. The tree, Davos said, practical as a knife. We have one. If it wants to help. Do trees want, you tell us, lad? He nodded at Bran. You tell us if the gods care for any of us. They care, Bran said, surprising himself with the cold certainty of it. They care as stones care for the shape of water. They are changed by us, and we by them. But they do not come down off the hill for any beggar's bowl. If I ask them with the right voice, if I ask without lying, if I offer what is mine to offer and not what belongs to another, they will answer. Men? And the man, Theon said. His tongue lingered on the word man, as if it were a fruit he had not tasted in a long time, and had missed each day. He will agree. He can. He is not all. Frost? Bran lifted his right hand. The place the Night King, Brandon, had gripped him, still knew the shape of that hand, as a shadow knows a step. He is listening, Bran said. He is waiting for a door to be left unbarred. You said door, Sansa murmured, almost to herself. Will you do it? Jon asked Bran plainly. He trusted plain talk. It had saved his life too few times, but enough. Will you go to him? Will you ask? Bran saw all their faces in a drift of time, and then saw beyond them the face he knew best of all. The one he had not seen in the world since he was a child climbing a tower for a view he thought belonged to him. His father's face, the patience in it, the honor that was a shield and a weight both. He knew what Ned Stark would say to a son who could do a hard thing to spare others, a harder. He knew what his mother would say. He knew what the wind would say through the lee of the east wall. What the roots would say as they shoved steadily through soil too poor for vegetables. He nodded. The plan would have been simple in a singer's song. It made a complicated shape in a keep full of people with their own small destinies. Sansa's mind moved in circles around it, tightening and loosening in turn. They would darken the yard fires early and douse the torches on the inner wall. The watches would be doubled, but half hidden. Arya would go where she wished to go. That could not be helped. And perhaps if it could be helped, it would be worse. Jon would walk the Godswood with Ghost at his heel, and lay his sword down under the great root where they had buried his father's bones. Theon would set himself and his men along the shadow of the eastern palisade, where the old apple trees grew. Sam would bring a page with the shapes of songs he could not sing, but could hold before Bran's eye. Gilly would sit behind a brazier with little Sam and hum, one of the old wildling airs that remembered warmth in the way the body remembers sun on closed eyes. Davos would keep the men honest, and Bran would ask. He would open himself and stand, and not be a boy in a chair, but something older that had learned to wear a boy comfortably. Snow fell without haste until it stopped altogether. The sky stripped to bone. It was remarkable how silence could grow louder than thunder. The first sound in that silence was the groan of the great gate's hinges unfurling one notch. Winterfell's breath drew in. The second sound was unsound, a flattening of the air that turned a flame sideways. The third sound was the barest crackle. Ice against ice. A musician running a fingernail along the rim of a thin glass to find a note. They came in no banner, no formation. They did not need to. The dead moved like a tide finding its old bed. At their head, he walked. He did not stride. He did not glide. He placed his feet, with the consideration of a man who has learned each length of his stride is a decision, and the earth will remember it. He had no weapon in his hand. He had the idea of a weapon in his right hand, and that was worse. He stopped beyond the low hillock, where the heart tree's roots rose and narrowed like knuckles. The pool lay between them, thin ice over its edges, making a delicate filigree that flinched from his presence. When he looked at the water had no surface. When he looked at the leaves, they held still as if the world had stopped to be painted. John was there. He laid Longclaw down on the stones and straightened slowly. Ghost's tail made one quiet swish, as if approving a courtesy. Arya was nowhere and everywhere. A crumb of snow fell from a branch to Bran's right, and he knew she had been there and was not there now. Theon kept his breath in his throat. Devos' left hand was relaxed. His right hand the one like a wrecked ship. He flexed it slowly and looked almost amused. Sansa stood beyond the first ring of trees in the cloak her mother should have worn. She held herself in the way women hold their children when they tell them true things that will hurt and save them both. Bran sat with his hands in his lap, and then he was no longer sitting. He had stood perhaps twice since he broke his back, once in a dream that had a feathered edge, once in the oiled hush of the cave where the roots were as old as stone. This was not like either. He put his hands on the arms of the chair, and they were not hands, and the arms were not wood. He pressed his palms to the idea of rising. The world obliged. He stood. He felt the weight of himself. No one moved. Even Arya, wherever she was, did not gasp. The Night King turned his head half the breadth of a hair. The movement was a winter's whisper. His eyes took Bran in. It was not triumph in them. It was recognition so profound it hurt. The mark on Bran's arm cooled until it was the absence of all warmth. He stepped around the pool. He stopped within reach. He did not speak. That knowledge kept its dignity. The conversation opened anyway. It was as if two doors had been set facing one another for years, and one had finally swung. It was happening in a room no one else could enter. Bran lifted his hand. His palm was a pale map. He showed it to the man with the absolute eyes. The man stared at the mark. It stared back at him. He looked up and into Bran, and then the face changed, not on the surface where the frost held its artistry, but in its order. A man looked through it. He was very tired. He was very old, with a kind of aging no time keeps. He wore a memory like a scarf. He remembered the smell of dog on a boy's hands. He remembered the way a longhouse sounds when men lift their bowls together and the timbers ring. He remembered a woman's hair unbinding itself across his chest. He remembered cold as the thing that fed the crops when it was mild and killed them when it had cause. Bran opened himself the way a wound does. He let the tree speak through him, not the god as prayer imagines gods, but the old law of sap and storm, and the bargain the forest made with men when men were too mortal to argue. He let his mouth shape the shape Sam had brought him, not with sound that would carry to human ears, but with intention that made the shapes into air. He let his blood rise to his palm, and he lifted the hand for the man to see his blood. The Night King looked at the blood and did not look away. He extended his right hand, the hand that had put the mark in Bran, and made him a page in a book older than writing. The fingers were elegant as crystal, and at their tips the nails were points like thought. He placed that hand over Bran's palm without touching it. Cold pressed against heat, but they did not meet. The space between their hands was a room where a year could live. Bran heard the first syllable of the first song. It went up through the roots and down through the ravens perched, and into the lungs of the wolves that slept, and made their dreams ache with the memory of a hunt that had never ended. He felt a shape under the man's breastbone. He took the shape in. It was slick and resistant both. It was the refusal of a knot to loosen. He saw depths of it. He saw reflections of himself in it. He saw other selves he might have been if the wind had blown different on a different mountain. And then he saw the truth of it with terrible clarity. The shard that had once been a tool held the idea of a purpose that had turned to habit. Habits can be broken. The wood told him so. The wood had broken the habit of winter before. Not by argument, by waiting. He waited. He waited with the patience of a stump in snow. He waited with the patience of Sansa counting sacks of oats to the last grain. He waited with the patience of a man who has to forgive himself without evidence every morning. He waited and sang, and the song had in it a note that was Bran's own life. And that note quivered, and Arya, wherever she was, felt the quiver along the edge of her knife without knowing why and smiled into her scarf. "Brandon," Bran said finally, and he said it in a voice that belonged to stone and to the boy who had slept with summer's fur under his cheek. "Not King, Brandon. Do you remember your mother's name?" The ice in the man's eyes trembled so subtly, it might have been the failing of a torchlight's reflection. The obsidian under his ribs heard the name as one hears a hammer strike above one's head. Dust fell in a flurry. The structure held. He answered, and no one heard him answer, and everyone did. The Queen's name was a soft northern word shaped like frost on lips, and when he formed it, the black water at their feet showed a single ring spreading out, and then stopping as if a hand had laid itself softly on the circle's path. "Let me pull," Bran whispered, and Jon heard nothing but the shape of the whisper tugged at the breath in his chest. Ghost growled once, low, and then quieted, and his ears pricked toward the heart tree as if he heard sap move. The Night King leaned forward. The space between their hands shrank to the width of a hair and then to the imagination of width. He bent his face to Bran's. A rime of frost crept along Bran's lashes and made them spokes. His breath was no breath. He offered nothing and everything. He would do no work. He would consent to be worked upon. Fire is a simple thing if you make it simple. The brazier by Gilly's knee cracked softly. A thin tongue of flame leaned toward the pool as if listening. From very far away came the groan of a dragon's bone, the wing in the underneath part of the sky where light is a guess. Bran felt heat that was not heat. It was the memory of the first warm day in spring when water can run under ice and pretend it is free. He drew that memory down his arm and into his palm, and through the shield of cold, and into the man's chest. It was not a lance. It was not an attack. It was a hand put into another hand in the dark. The obsidian identified it. It tightened. It would have been easier if it had hardened completely and shattered like a brittle river stone under a hammer. Then they would have been soaked with the grief of it, and the shards would have cut him to red ribbons, and that would have been the end in a different story. The tidy ending in which men grieved and said they had done what they could. This was worse. It softened. It resisted that softening. It yielded like a jaw, unclenching under shame. The man's back bowed. His mouth opened, and the cold in it burned. The air tasted of flint, struck on flint. The roots under them hummed a note that made Theon's knees almost give. He put a hand out and steadied himself on the tree, and did not think about what hand on what wood could mean. Bran pressed. He sang. He pressed without force and sang without words. He took into his other hand the hot wetness of blood he had drawn with his own small knife, and dragged his thumb through it and pressed it to the man's sternum, and the blood smoked and did not freeze. A crack sounded, audible, ordinary, like a clay cup breaking in a kitchen a mile away. Then another. Then it was as if the ribs themselves were remembering they had once learned to move because lungs had told them to. The obsidian withdrew by a finger's width, and the man made a sound like a heron's cry across a river. Breath threaded through it as a wonder. His absolute eyes lost a shard of their absoluteness. Winter eased an inch. "Steady," Davos murmured, and meant it to himself and to no one else. But the steadiness poured across the yard and held like a net over all the terror and prevented it from becoming panic. Beyond the pool, the dead leaned forward in the smallest degree. Their master's shape changed. The rope that held them tugged. Some would have moved. Something moved before they could. From nowhere and everywhere, a little black arrow thrummed and struck an empty patch of ice at the pool's edge. It quivered and then lay down. Theon had not loosed it. His men had not. The arrow's flight had said, I am here. I have 1,000 more of me. Do not invent a reason to use us." Arya slid back into the world on the branch of the apple tree beyond the nearest palisade. Her breath smoked her scarf. Her eyes were pleased and entirely unsentimental. She had not knocked an arrow. She had only asked the air to believe she might. The air had believed her. Bran watched a series of memories cross the face before him. They were not in order, and they made an honest chaos. A boy tripping on the threshold of a hall because his boots were too big, and his father swallowing laughter that would have embarrassed him. A hunt in the snow, the dog bounding, the smell of fat on a spit, his sister's fingers pricking on a bone needle, and her mouth making a curse their mother would not tolerate, and the two of them laughing until they could not breathe. A woman's face with the sort of beauty that made other women distrust her without wanting to. And the frost in her lashes when she stood on the wall and said she had no fear at all. A child that lived only a year, and the way he became a season no one spoke about in that house again with any finish. Bran took all of that and made no judgments. He did not have the right. He was not a judge. He was a surgeon of a sort. He eased the obsidian a finger's width more. He heard the winter in it complain in the voice of old logs that burn reluctantly and popped at. "Mother," the man said clearly, and Sansa flinched as if she had been struck. Because the name he spoke was not her mother's, and yet it was every mother's name. Jon closed his eyes and saw his own mother's dark eyes in the candlelight of a room that smelled of blood and lilies, and the lie of peace that birth makes before it teaches you war. He held his sword's hilt an inch above the stone, and then let his fingers loosen and step away from it again. He put his hand on Ghost's neck, and the wolf's fur held chill like fur laid in snow for hours, and then brought to fire. Once more, Sam breathed. He had not meant to speak. Gilly's hand slid to his wrist and found his pulse and steadied it. Once more, Bran laid his blood-slick thumb over the precise spot where the shard met the heart's oldest wall. He pressed as if he were asking a child to yield a toy, not because the toy mattered, but because the child's yielding did. He sang. He put into the song the exact tone of Sansa's voice when she read lists and made the numbers love the people they were for. He put into it Arya's clean, pleased cruelty toward things that deserved to be cut open and named by their true names. He put into it Jon's habit of choosing the heavier burden and making it sit across his shoulders until it forgot to be heavy. He put into it Theon's apology. He put into it Summer's brilliant, greedy heart. He put into it his father's silence, and his mother's hands over his when he had been small and afraid of thunder. The shard sighed. It released. There was no blaze. There was no tearing whirl of power. There was a kiss of air. There was the very small sound of something set down gently on a table. The Night King, Brandon, made a sound that was folly to call a cry, because crying belongs to the living, and this made a new language around itself. He bent. He would have fallen if Bran had not put his arms up instinctively, and learned in the same instant that arms can be his again, and shoulders can take weight. The man slumped against him, and the cold did not flay him. It was only cold, and cold can coexist with warmth. Then it happened to the army the way tides happen when the moon changes her mind. There was no shuddering collapse. There was a thinning of intent. The line that had pulled them slackened as if cut. Men and women who had been dead became the sort of dead that belongs to earth, not to a will. They stood because winter could hold them up for a moment. Then they sank, softly, and the snow covered them where they lay. The horses of bone tilted, hesitated as if thinking of grass they had once known, and then folded like tents. In the far dark of the yard, a giant made of 1,000 years of bones, and remembered fear went down as if kneeling, and then rolled like a boulder to its side, and became a hill of bones that already looked like they had always been there. There was one who did not fall. A woman of the dead whose hair had caught all the night's frost and made an intricate crown that no human hands could have devised stood at the edge of the pool, and watched her king bow and become a man. Her eyes were mistakes of beauty. She had no more purpose. She took one step toward the water. Sansa saw her and felt an ache like sympathy and a swift rush of fury on behalf of every living girl whose life had been cut and stolen. She did not move. The woman's foot touched the thin skin of ice and broke it. She stepped into the black water and dissolved as cleanly as salt. Silence reopened after noise, and it was a different silence. This one had room to breathe. The ravens shook themselves, as if waking from a dream that had gone too long. The dogs somewhere beyond the kitchens began to bark in their usual foolish way. The men on the walls had to cough because their throats had held their breath too long. Bran staggered. It felt like the falling down of a high place. His knees forgot they had not been knees for years, and tried to manage his weight, and failed. He would have gone onto the stones and cracked his temple if Theon had not moved with a quickness that made no sound, and taken him around the ribs. The Ironborn's hands were hard and careful. He knelt with Bran and did not let him fall. The man who had been the Night King lay on his side. He was not naked. He wore the proof of centuries on him. He wore the pattern of cold like a second skin, and as it melted it left lines. His hair was close-cropped and white, not with age but with a memory of ice. His face was loud with ancestry. Men would argue about which ancestor for as long as men had anything left to argue about. His mouth moved. He said a name. It was not his. It was the name of the woman with the frost in her lashes who had watched him be remade, and had not turned her head away. Jon was the first to kneel, disarmed, hands plain and empty. He looked at the man and could not find hatred in himself anywhere. He was too tired. He had only pity left, and the long, steady yearning that men in the north carry like tools. For a day that works, for work that feeds their own. "You are home," he said, and meant the word home with all its terrors and its safety both. Sansa stepped forward until she stood almost at the pool's lip. She was Lady of Winterfell, and no other name would fit. She looked at the man who had been enemy and calamity and story, and she thought about the children in the great hall, and the way they had eaten with their heads down and their spoons quick and quiet. She thought about the women who had sewn until their fingertips bled, the men who had raised palisades for wood they'd never get back. She thought about what it does to a people to be given something to love and something to hate. She thought about how difficult it is to keep those two loves in order. "Brandon," she said. The word scratched her throat. "Can you stand?" He moved his hands like he was collecting flakes of memory. He pushed himself up. He failed the first time and smiled. The smile landed badly on his face and then learned its place. He tried again and came to one knee, and then the other. When he was upright, he did not tower. He was a man, tall as men in the north are often tall, not the moving geometry of a winter's fury. He looked at the heart tree, and his eyes filled like a man who had walked into his boyhood hall and smelled his father's cloak. He reached toward the white bark without touching it. He knelt, his head bent. A single tear slid from his eye. It did not freeze. The night took a breath and gave it back like a promise. Men on the walls began to speak, first in murmurs, and then in voices that rose and fell like a river over stones. Someone laughed, and it broke others into laughter, as if along a seam. Someone wept without shame. Davos rubbed his good hand over his mouth, and then let it drop, and looked up at the clouds, and told them not to be fools. Sam put his forehead on his folded hands for a moment, and then lifted it, and looked at Gilly and little Sam, and discovered he had discovered the pleasure of being right, and did not need to announce it. He would write it later, as neatly as he could. He would leave room for the parts he could not explain. He would not lie. He would not say the gods had a plan. He would say men asked, and trees answered. The dead lay where they had fallen, and they were no longer a threat, except as the sorrow of the world is always a threat when it is fresh and large, and a man might drown in it. They would need to be burned. There would be rites to invent and rites to remember. Even in salvation there is the dull work of a village. "Bring him in," Sansa said, and the men there took her words as law. "Not to my father's hall. To the solar. It is small enough to warm. He will need something warm. He will need a name to call his own." "Ben Benmajawal." Theon gathered Bran. He lifted him as a brother lifts a brother who is both older and younger than he is. His face was careful, and his eyes had bright water in them that he might lie about later. He walked where men made room for him because they preferred to live in a world where a broken man could carry a prince, and that could be true. Jon and Davos, and two of the Umbers who were not boys anymore, took hold of the man who had been the Night King under his arms and across his back, lifting without making him a burden. He did not resist them. He let himself be carried. His fingers curled in reflex and then unfurled, learning how to be hands again. Ghost paced beside, curious in that flat, calm way of wolves who accept anything that does not threaten what they have decided to protect. In the solar, the air held the faint odor of parchment and beeswax and the ghost of spiced wine. The shutters had been closed against the cold, but a line of light slipped in where the left shutter didn't sit quite flush. It made a bar across the floor that moved not at all. A brazier burned. The man looked at it for a long time as if it were a language he had not heard in a while, then held his hands toward it at a distance and decided that was close enough. Fetch the maester, Sansa said. But Bran said, wait. And they waited. Bran's voice had salt in it and the sound of leaves. He rolled himself the last foot to the chair that had never left him and let himself fall into it and feel the relief in the costly bones. He looked at the man before him, and the godswood inside him leaned as if to see with his eyes. Tell us your name, Bran said gently. The man's mouth tried the concept of names. He shaped one. It had the feel of an older tongue, the worn edges, the ways certain letters like R and D came off the teeth as if it were meat. He said, Brandon. And then he said a second name that had weather in it. A word of the old patriarchal sort. A name men would hang on sons when they wanted them to bear the top of the world on their backs. Snow, some would have called him. Not Stark, not yet. Names are oaths and property, and the permission of the living to the dead, and those permissions must be granted. Sansa nodded, because kindness is the correct form of ruthlessness most days. Brandon, she said, you are at Winterfell. Do you know Winterfell? He nodded very slowly. He looked toward an interior corridor and smiled the small, surprised smile of a man who has smelled an old corridor's damp and known it without any thinking. He reached for a set of words and found them too far. He shook his head once, and his eyes were abashed, as an old knight might be abashed to drop a spoon. Maester, Sansa said then, and Podrick ran without looking like he ran. The way a good squire moves when he is already doing the next thing. They bathed the man's chest with warm water in a cloth. The wound where the obsidian had entered was not a wound now. It was the trace of a branch and bark, something the tree tells you about the wind that bent it once, and the way it grew around the bending and made it into strength. The maester's hands trembled. He schooled them. He cleaned what could be cleaned. He set broth to warm and herbs to steep in a small packet that he buried in the coals to awaken. He did not presume. It is a maester's pride to know where he is useless. Bran watched the man watch them. His eyes moved, not like a predator's now, but like a fisherman's. A patient, doting movement that takes in the smallness of the world and loves it without the lie that it will last. When Jon spoke, the man watched Jon's mouth, as if cataloging the shape of the words. When Sansa gave orders, he recognized the sound of a ruling, and his gaze went respectful. He knew very little of the language. He knew more of the tones of voices. He recognized gratitude when the little boy brought him the bowl with both hands, tongue stuck out of the corner of his mouth with the effort of not spilling. He bowed his head and took the bowl like a sacred thing. He tasted the broth and closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was a tear in the corner. He did not wipe away. If he remembered the years he had ruled the dead, he did not try to tell those years to anyone. If he remembered the terror he had been, he carried it like a man who knows his own crimes and does not ask absolution. He asked for a word though, pointing to his chest, and then looking at Sansa like a man asking for bread. Name, Sam said, helpful and eager. And the man nodded, pleased at matching the sound to the thing. Brandon, Sansa said again. And then, after a long measured thought that put her mother's careful justice into her bones, off Winterfell, if you want it, if you will carry it as we do, if you will submit yourself to its law. The man bowed his head, very low, until his forehead brushed the rim of the bowl he had not yet finished. He set the bowl down with reverence and pressed his palm to the stone. He spoke a dozen words, and in them were sheep and frost and fur and iron and the turning of the very old wheel. When he had done, he looked up, and his eyes were human and full. "You have a claim?" Davos asked later, when the room had emptied to a circle, and they had breathed and the brazier's heat had made the room smell of clean metal. "You know how men get about claims." "Let them," Sansa said. She had put the ledger aside and taken up the business of hospitality as if it were a sword. "If we can feed the living through the next 2 weeks, we can afford their opinions. For now, he is a man in need of soup. That is a small enough crown for him to carry." Jon said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He had my look." And he stared into the brazier as if the coals might agree or disagree. "He had the North's look. We forget sometimes the North looks back at us and knows our shape better than we do. I'll send riders. Daenerys should know. She will want to know. She will have a view." Sansa's mouth flicked in a smile that could have cut paper. "She will. We all do." Bran closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was in a corridor that had not existed for 100 years. And boys were running down it. And a woman stuck out her foot and tripped one, and he fell and burst into laughter that had no war in it at all. That would not be the last door. There would be meat carved and set before men who had thought to die hungry. There would be a pyre that burned for 3 days and 3 nights and smoked the snow with honesty. There would be arguments and the whisper of claim, and a raven sent south under a sky that had remembered how to bear wings in warmth and had to learn again. There would be a woman in the kitchens who would look at the man who had been winter and tell him to fetch another pail of water if he had hands, and if he didn't, she'd find a boy to do it with better sense. There would be dreams. There would be a moment a week hence when the man would take 2 steps into the God's Wood at dawn and put his forehead to the heart tree and leave it there for a long time, and the bark would leave a white mark on his skin, and he would wear it like a joyful wound. Night had not finished with them. Out beyond the wall's shadow lay cold that did not care for their plots, a patient cold. Out beyond that cold lay other bargains that had been struck under other trees, and with other voices. The man they had unbound had been a lock on a door built so long ago. The builders had grown into the wood and gone down to the ants. Removing locks can be a matter of faith, and faith is always a bet. Bran did not tell them that. He listened to the brazier's hiss and to the small splinter run of snow sliding from eaves. He watched the man who was learning how to hold his spoon and not burn himself, and how to say thank you with all the seriousness of a vow. He thought of the faces in the pool and the leaves speaking through him. He looked down at his hands. They trembled a little. He put them flat on his knees. Later, when the maester had made a pallet for Brandon on the floor where he could sleep in sight of others and wake without fear, when Jon had gone to the battlements and spoken to the ghosts of his dead and sworn new oaths to the living, when Sansa had moved through the hall like a drop of oil on water smoothing chaos into a sheen, when Arya had eaten by the hearth with her eyes half amused and met Bran's gaze and made a tiny face that said, "You and Arya had eaten." The smoke rose from the black pool gentle as cooking steam. The ravens made small sounds to themselves and preened. The heart tree's carved eyes looked and did not need to blink. "Thank you," Bran said aloud. Though he was alone and the tree said nothing, and its nothing said everything he needed to hear. He lifted his marked arm, and the skin there looked like ordinary skin. And it was, and it wasn't. He made a fist and opened it. He felt the ghost of a hand take his, the oldest hand, the one that had pressed into his palm, and asked him to carry a winter that wasn't his. "I will," he said into the cold. "For a while longer. As long as I can." The wind moved finally and shook a few leaves with sound. It sounded almost like laughter. Or perhaps, after all, like breathing,